Hi, everyone. The audio on the recording that I just did wasn't so great. So I'm actually messing around with a new microphone. And I think that to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and do a little speed repeat of the lecture before class. Hopefully it'll be useful to you as well. So we started out with group discussions, asking people to think about what the term policy means to them versus the term politics, since we are transitioning from a discussion about environmental policy options to a discussion about politics. And what people came up with in class was largely a consensus that policy refers to decisions that governments or non-governmental agencies take, whereas politics refers to the discussions, the conversations, the processes that kind of frame and ultimately lead to those decisions or conclusions. And a couple of definitions that I think are useful of these terms include policy as a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by an organization or individual. That's the kind of dictionary definition. Another way to think about policy is as being a decision. So people in class were really right on the money in terms of how they were thinking about that. Politics is a term that means different things to different people. One definition from the dictionary is activities associated with the governance of an area or country, especially the debate between parties having power. So kind of connoting partisan debate there. Another definition proffered by Harold Laswell, one of the kind of earlier political scientists of the 20th century, was the question of who gets what, how, and when. So a question about equity, the distribution of benefits. Or the process of determining policy involving the exercise of power by different actors with goals and incentives all their own, with the objective, with the goal of securing more resources and also of holding on to power itself. That's how I really think about politics, and that really frames a lot of the work that I do as a political ecologist. So a big question, thinking about the distribution of benefits and the question of who gets what when it comes to climate change, is who's responsible for it, who has an obligation to act, and who's going to benefit from different policies that we might choose to enact to address it. So that's going to be the essence of what we're talking about today. And there's two headlines that were making the rounds a couple of years ago, several years ago now, that I think are kind of illustrative here. So this is a headline, obviously, from The Onion, meant to be a joke, that says, "New report finds climate change caused by 7 billion key individuals." Contrast that with a headline that has made rounds several times that says just 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions. And that's from a group of different scientific studies that assess which firms are responsible through the products that they sell, through the products that they extract for most emissions. And what people in class discussed when we put these two headlines out there was whether or not this is really a funny joke that The Onion is making, or what kind of the basis of it is. And what folks told me is that they found this to be poking fun at the notion that there's just a few firms involved in global emissions, because in fact there's 7 billion people on Earth, and most of them have some role to play in climate change, presumably, or some responsibility, maybe even for climate change. But at the same time, the joke may fall flat, because obviously it's actually not true that everyone has equal responsibility for climate change. In fact, some individuals, some groups have a much greater contribution to emissions than others. So there's some limitations to The Onion's attempted joke there. At the same time, there might be limitations to this assessment too, because yeah, there's companies that are responsible, a small number of companies that are responsible for a lot of emissions, but at the same time, consumers do purchase the products that those companies sell. So does that not mean that consumers also bear some responsibility? How do we think about that? How do we unpack that? So this has really big implications for how we address climate change, in large part because of the sheer scale of the challenge, the magnitude of the task of decarbonization of the economy. So a couple of kind of factoids, and we posted on Moodle a lecture by Saul Griffith that I think breaks a lot of this stuff down particularly effectively. I'd highly recommend watching that when you get a chance. But overall, the challenge is pretty tremendous. There's a huge dependency globally on fossil fuels. This data is a little bit old, but it really hasn't changed all that much. Overall, there was about 18 terawatts of power across all different sectors on Earth, maybe 10 years ago. What would it take to actually replace all of that fossil fuel capacity, all that fossil fuel energy, with renewables, with wind, water, and solar? And if you remember the Jacobson piece that we looked at a couple weeks ago that presented this kind of roadmap to a 100% renewable world, they set forth a bunch of different options, or a specific mix of options that could get us there. But what would it actually take to build that infrastructure? It would be pretty massive. What it amounts to is something like 100 square meters of solar cells put on the grid, put on the ground every second for the next 25 years, assuming 15% efficiency. In addition to 50 square meters of solar thermal mirrors every second for the next 25 years, 12 3-megawatt wind turbines deployed in great locations every hour. And if we're trying to replace liquid fuels with sustainable biofuels that don't come out of the ground, that don't deplete, that don't resurface ancient fossilized algae like what petroleum is, we would need an Olympic-sized swimming pool of algae every second for the next 25 years. So this is pretty tremendous, and you can imagine how this might affect different groups differently. This would have very different effects on the fossil fuel industry than it might on consumers. Depending on who might get jobs in these industries, it might benefit different groups differently. These are really important things to think about. So what options are on the table to get to these places? To recap kind of the three major categories in my mind of policy interventions that could help to affect this transition, there's a few of them. The first one I think of as being kind of regulation. And that includes things like protected areas wherein governments can basically say, this piece of land, this polygon on the map is protected. It's going to be impossible, it's going to be illegal to cut down the forests there, to build developments there, to carry out various types of activities that can degrade the environment there, that might contribute to emissions that might not be compatible with our environmental objectives. This also includes pollution controls, saying that certain chemicals, certain compounds are too dangerous to permit to be emitted in unlimited quantities, that we need to limit certain things, like lead in water, great example. The EPA in the United States has historically been responsible for a lot of these types of regulations. Banning outright certain types of activities. Fracking has attracted a lot of attention in the media, in public discourse over the last 10 years. Fracking is an approach to extracting natural gas that's a lot cheaper than earlier technologies. It essentially allows people to extract small, isolated pockets of natural gas in the rock that would be too expensive to drill independently by pumping water, or not water, a fluid, the contents of which can be unknown, horizontally into the ground to push that natural gas up to the surface where it can be more easily extracted. But it has big adverse consequences for water supply. And as a result, there's a lot of pressure to ban it outright. That's another approach that's on the table. Another set of approaches that we talked about a lot during the Energy Policy Week include economic incentives. And there's different types of approaches here, but they have a fundamental kind of principle in common. And that principle is that the social cost of emissions, of doing things that emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, is not directly faced by the firm or the company or even the individual doing the emitting, right? If I'm a company making cars, producing cars could generate a lot of pollution. I share the cost of that pollution in terms of environmental degradation, public health costs, et cetera, with everyone in the country, potentially all 7 billion or so people on the planet. But I get 100% of the profit, which means that I have no incentive to reduce the number of cars I make or make cars in a cleaner fashion. Taxes, subsidies, cap and trade, all of these are approaches that attempt to make the firm face the full cost, or something closer to the full cost, the social and environmental cost of the actions that they're carrying out, such that I might be forced to make fewer cars because I face a higher cost from making cars inefficiently, uncleanly, or to the extent that I'm doing it, right? Taxes and cap and trade are different and similar. We talked about that a lot in class in the previous week. But essentially, taxes try to attach a certain cost, a social or environmental cost to every ton of carbon that's emitted, so that if I'm a company, I'm going to want to produce less such that I am aligned with the kind of socially optimal level of production. Cap and trade doesn't tax the carbon per se, but rather it caps the total amount of emissions that we can allow. And because it now is not possible to emit as much carbon as I want without paying for a carbon credit, it in practice becomes more expensive for me to emit. So the effect is pretty similar in a lot of ways, although there's differences in terms of how it's implemented and who might kind of prefer which system. You'll sort of see that a lot of fossil fuel companies have tended to prefer cap and trade. And part of the reason why that is because they can influence the distribution of carbon credits at the beginning of these policies, oftentimes in a way that has benefited larger companies over smaller ones, whereas carbon taxes are usually thought of as being kind of universally applied, which leaves less room for that kind of political negotiation. There's other arguments and ideas out there. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's this other idea called fee and dividend, which is similar to cap and trade, but crucially, the idea is, or similar to a carbon tax, but crucially, the revenue that's generated from the carbon tax doesn't go to the government, but is instead redistributed to the people. And that can be done in progressive ways or regressive ways, but either way, it takes that money out of the public coffers and puts it back into household income, into households' revenue streams. That also takes public investment off the table, interestingly, and we'll circle back to that in a minute. So another kind of category of intervention is public investment itself. These are things like green jobs programs that are getting a lot of attention now, are still part of the conversation about a potential future Green New Deal, also very much in the mix of what other countries around the world are doing. Public transit, clean transit infrastructure, huge opportunity as well for making it so that people don't have to drive to get to work, so that people can potentially live closer to where they need to work. In the case of public housing and new urban density movements that allow people to live, work, and play in close proximity, right? Public utilities, a strategy to put renewable energy on the grid under the control of publicly controlled entities that are democratically managed. And in that way, the public, the people that live in a place, whether it's a municipality, a state, or even a country, have a direct say in what types of energy is invested in, what types of energy they get. All right. So how are these different choices selected between? What's the process for making a decision? Well, one of my favorite examples comes from the area that I work in. I'm a political ecologist. I do conservation advocacy and action research, primarily in the Amazon, really looking at how deforestation, especially of the sort that does not benefit local communities that live in and around forests, can be reduced. And one of the things that we always run into is the fact that whether or not an area is legally allowed to be deforested depends on whether or not it's considered a forest in the first place. So what constitutes a forest? Well, sometimes it can be pretty counterintuitive. This might look like a forest, but believe it or not, this is actually an agricultural field. This might look like a plantation, but believe it or not, it's actually a forest. This might look like a forest, and indeed it is a forest, so sometimes things are more or less as they appear. But what's the difference here? Why are the forests forests and the non-forests non-forests? Well, this is a bit of a kind of trick question in a way, because it's not a matter of ecological decision making. It's not about the density of trees. The forests are forests because governments decide that they are forests, because states have issued policies declaring them to be forests with huge implications for what activities can be carried out in these areas. But states don't act in a vacuum. Governments make decisions subject to pressure from all kinds of different organizations, from environmentalist and advocacy groups, to agricultural firms, to fossil fuel companies, to small farmers, local communities, and indigenous people, and also urban residents, teachers, workers, students, voters. All of these different groups with different agendas try to affect and advance their agendas through a process that we can call politics, through a bunch of different strategies and tactics. And this is crucial to understand because it helps us to realize that oftentimes seemingly technical decisions, down to the level of what counts as a forest, are actually political decisions, because different groups have a stake in declaring different places to be forests or non-forests, in pursuing one type of environmental policy over another, in pursuing a carbon tax over cap and trade, or vice versa, right? So how do these types of groups exert influence? Lots of different strategies. Different groups use different types of approaches. There's influencing the media, crafting public narratives. There's protests and direct action. There's money in politics, right? Campaign finance, trying to fund elections and support politicians economically that might favor your agenda. Strikes that workers might deploy in order to get better pay, get benefits, etc. Electoral politics, and yes, sometimes violence. Historically, violence has played a tremendous role in how change gets made. But I would argue that different groups, and I think this is important to understand, are more and less likely to use different mixes of these tactics. Citizen groups, NGOs, and lobbyists tend to engage in protests that agitate, voter mobilization, get out the vote, letter writing, boycotts and consumer action, communications, public relations, shaping the narrative, right? This is the kind of mix that you might expect from these types of groups. Public and private sector workers can engage in protests, unionization, and fundraising for campaigns, turning out rank and file votes for politicians, and ultimately strikes, one of the most powerful tools that workers, regardless of the sector, have in their toolkit. The state itself is usually not monolithic. There can be competing interests and ideas within a state. Military and police violence can be used to influence and suppress movements. The state, too, crafts public narratives, either through state media or sympathetic private media. And also, they can fund programs that build constituencies, carry out policies that deliver real benefits to people and make them more likely to support the state or a certain faction within the state. Private firms across sectors, they might fund campaigns. They have been known to influence research and science in a way that makes their agenda more palatable. They fund media and public relations campaigns. And ultimately, kind of the final ace up the sleeve of big companies is something known as a capital strike. And as someone in class pointed out when we had this discussion, a capital strike refers to basically threatening to take their business elsewhere. If labor and environmental regulations become too onerous in their view, if they become too costly, they can threaten to simply move their business to another country, to another jurisdiction with less regulation. All right? Okay, so I'm going to pivot now to talk about something that happened pretty recently. And it was really unique in my lifetime because I think it brings together different social movements with particular types of demands in a way that I had never seen before. So I want to spend a little time talking about that because I think it has a lot to teach us about the current moment that we're in and remains so recent and relevant that we should all be paying attention to what it means for us. And the story is teachers going on strikes and how that connects to the environment. There was a wave of teachers' strikes starting in 2018 in places like West Virginia, places like Oklahoma, Arizona, other states as well. I'm going to focus on West Virginia and a little bit on Oklahoma right now, though. So this is an image from West Virginia. And a lot of people, when they think about West Virginia, they think about coal. West Virginia is one of the poorest states in the United States. It has historically been a source of coal. Some have even called it an internal domestic resource colony because of how little it has been invested in terms of providing services and improving people's quality of life in kind of a holistic way, and how much it has provided coal that has fueled US industry, development, and even empire. But if you look at how coal has changed over time in West Virginia, even as coal production, and that's that red line over here on the graph, has increased over time, the number of jobs in the coal industry has actually gone down over time. So why might that be? Well, it has to do with technology and the technologies of extraction. This image right here depicts mountaintop removal coal mining, which is a particularly dramatic and destructive form of coal extraction. Mountaintop removal is basically what it sounds like. It involves explosives being used to blast off the vegetation and topsoil of areas that have a lot of coal in them. So the coal can be extracted directly. Now, this has hugely destructive consequences for watersheds. It contaminates water massively. It actually can cause debris to land on people's houses, physically destroying communities or parts of communities. And it's had a really bad legacy in Appalachia and in West Virginia. Despite this history, despite the fact that jobs have been declining, a lot of people in West Virginia do indeed identify with coal mining. There's a strong cultural association with it that goes back a long way. There's a strong political association with it that goes back a long way. This photo right here depicts the Battle of Blair Mountain. You may not have heard of it before, and maybe you have. It was a major moment in the coal wars in West Virginia in the early part of the 20th century. In 1920, in Logan County, West Virginia, for 5 days from late August to early September in 1921, some 10,000 armed coal miners confronted 3,000 lawmen and strikebreakers called the Logan Defenders, who were backed by coal mine operators during the miners' attempts to unionize the southwestern West Virginia coal fields when tensions really rose between workers and mine management. They were targeted by these nice-looking fellows in fedoras, the Baldwin Felts agents, who gunned down the sheriff of one of the local towns, precipitating kind of the main wave of violence and the standoff that was the Battle of Blair Mountain. And it's important to note a couple of things about this. So this is a major moment that has marked a lot of the history and kind of cultural memory of West Virginia. It was people trying to assert their rights as workers against not just the government, but companies, not just the companies, but the government as well, who supported the coal mining industry. It was also a multiracial movement. People of many different backgrounds, recent immigrants from Europe, from Ireland and Scotland, the Scots-Irish from Ulster, as well as African Americans, formerly enslaved people as well, banded together, joined forces, worked in solidarity to assert their rights as workers through shared struggle. So, with this background, how does this connect to what we're seeing in West Virginia kind of more recently? Well, West Virginia recently was kind of the first starting point for the teachers' strikes that swept the country in the last couple of years. And the average annual teacher salary in West Virginia, along with some of these other states, was pretty low compared to the US average, at just $45,000 a year. In addition, you can see that healthcare premiums went up and up and up, right? And the straw that kind of broke the camel's back with the West Virginia teachers' strikes was that the school district said that teachers would have to pay higher healthcare premiums. These are teachers, again, who are already struggling to make ends meet, that already have really under-resourced classrooms, that don't have what they need to actually teach well, would have to pay higher premiums if they didn't wear a Fitbit and keep track of how many steps they took in order to basically prove that they were getting enough exercise. So this is straight out of an episode of Black Mirror. It's rather dystopian, and the teachers said, nah, hell no, we are not gonna go with this. And the teachers then organized in the cafeterias, on Facebook, without, by the way, the blessing of the union bosses to do this, to do a few things that I think are really remarkable. They said, we want better wages, we want better health care. Not only that, we want better wages and health care for all public sector employees, not just us as teachers, but we want to work in solidarity with everyone else that is facing similar struggles. Not only did they work in solidarity across these kind of sectoral divisions within the state, but they said the way that you're going to pay for this stuff is principally going to be by taxing the coal industry, hearkening back to the multiracial working class struggles of the early 20th century. These teachers said that they wanted to take on the fossil fuel industry, that they wanted a share of those benefits. They wanted a fair share of those benefits. And this is really remarkable because it's the first time in my memory that I've seen a social movement, a workers' movement, directly take on the fossil fuel industry, directly connect to the climate struggle. So I think that that's just pretty amazing. And another thing that I think is worth keeping in mind with respect to the kind of electoral history of the United States is that West Virginia, even though it's thought of as a quote unquote red state these days, it tends to maybe vote for Republicans at the national level, has not always been that way. West Virginia did not flip to becoming a Republican voting state after the Civil Rights Movement. So the South was largely a Democratic stronghold until the Civil Rights Movement, when under the kind of Southern strategy that Richard Nixon deployed and Ronald Reagan would also kind of solidify, those states flipped to the Republican Party as the Republican Party sought to pick them up, in many ways feeding upon racist attitudes of white folks in the South. West Virginia did not go that route. West Virginia remained a Democratic stronghold practically through into the 21st century. And what this means is that these are people who are going on strike who, while they're in a red state, they also have lots of Democratic leadership, Democratic Party leadership, not just at the national level, but at the state level. So this is a group of people that has seen their incomes decline, has seen healthcare costs go up, has seen jobs get lost in the coal industry due to mechanization, presided over largely by a Democratic Party that was not fighting for their interests. So this is a group of people that has no real reason to think that the Democratic Party is a viable vehicle for their aspirations. And that's interesting because we don't tend to think of quote unquote red states in this country as being fertile ground for these types of movements that favor workers, favor teachers, favor public spending, favor militant challenges to the fossil fuel industry. And yet that's exactly what happened in West Virginia. Oklahoma, similar deal, except in Oklahoma, it's oil and gas. Teachers fought in Oklahoma for similar reasons, for similar causes, and they asked that the funding come from taxing the natural gas industry. They were victorious. In West Virginia, they won better pay. Oklahoma won pay through a gas tax. In West Virginia, there's still hurdles to clear because the coal industry is so entrenched and so connected to the state legislature that it's been challenging to directly confront them. But this movement really did put the industry on its back foot in a meaningful way. And we've seen kind of proof of concept that this set of strategies, this kind of tactical approach, yielded results in a lot of these places. So how do groups assert political influence? Well, clearly we saw strikes here as the main thing, strikes and protests, also media and public narrative. The teachers did a lot of work to tell their story. They made sure to find ways to get food and essentials to students that might not have other alternatives. And it was a really diverse, it was a tactically diverse movement in that way. But other groups were also involved in this. The fossil fuel industry, folks that oppose teachers, certainly tried to portray teachers as being greedy, portray them as being stubborn, portray them as not having the public's interest at heart. And when it comes to climate change, this has a longer history. ExxonMobil, for example, knew for a long time, for decades, that climate change was happening. And they deliberately acted to suppress that science. This is pretty well documented. They cut funding for climate research upon finding out, once they kind of knew that climate change was happening, despite the fact that they had internal memos and internal science that repeatedly showed that this was happening. Great book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called The Merchants of Doubt that really tracks in detail how corporate actors, Exxon, Chevron, groups like that, spent a lot of money funding science denial. How they didn't just do it alone through science, but also worked with favorable media, with sympathetic media to advance narratives that confused climate science, that suggested that there is doubt and uncertainty and disagreement in the scientific community about climate change. We now know, of course, that science is in consensus, in agreement, that climate change is happening, that it's anthropogenic, that fossil fuels have a lot to do with it. But nevertheless, some of these suspicions remained important, even as the teachers went on strike and tried to push back against these industries and tried to limit their effectiveness. So one thing that I think is worth thinking about is how durable are these victories? If teachers are getting paid from oil and gas, what pathway do we have to getting off and becoming independent from those resources in the long run? This is a tougher question, and we're not going to solve it right this second, but I would encourage you to really think about that. What is the pathway of moving forward to use these types of movements to create an even bigger opening for a bigger and deeper transformation of the economy? All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit right now. So this right here is the Kaya identity. And this is a way to think about the overall emissions of an economy. And what the Kaya identity says is that the total emissions of an economy, the total CO2 emissions, are equal to the product of four factors: population times the GDP per capita times the energy efficiency of the economy, that is how much energy you need per unit of GDP, times the carbon intensity of your energy. How much do you emit for each unit of energy? And the implication, and I would encourage you to take this framework with a grain of salt because, like all things, in my view, it is political. The implication is that there are 4 and only 4 ways to decarbonize an economy. You can reduce population, you can reduce GDP per capita, or slow growth, or reduce growth at least. You can make your economy more efficient. This is the one thing that kind of happens spontaneously over time as firms seek to become more efficient. Or you can make your energy supply more renewable and have less emissions, fewer emissions associated with it. That's switching from coal to solar and wind, switching from natural gas to solar and wind, etc. So there's an idea in climate policy land that a lot of people advance. They call it the iron law of climate policy. It's been formulated and articulated in a bunch of different ways, but the gist of it is that any environmental policy that seriously compromises economic growth, GDP, will not be politically viable. Such policy ideas should therefore be considered dead on arrival. They shouldn't really be considered at all because they are simply not going to happen, because they are political non-starters. Now in class, when we talked about this, we did a quick scan of the room to see who kind of at a glance thought that this makes sense. Does not cutting GDP make people worse off? Doesn't it lead to job cuts, etc.? Most people actually didn't seem to, at their instinctual level, think that this was likely the case. And the reasons that some of your classmates advanced for this were very much aligned with the reality, which is that over time in the United States, GDP per capita has increased pretty dramatically, while wages, real median weekly earnings of full-time workers, has pretty much been flat since 1980. So what explains that? Well, what explains it is that a lot of that GDP increase is due to private profits being accumulated, is due to benefits that accrue to the already wealthy and to those who hold stocks and shares and stocks of private companies, of publicly traded companies. It doesn't necessarily translate into public infrastructure, public services, or wages. And this is crucial to understand, because if the iron law, to the extent that it's true, works, that policies that compromise economic growth or even compromise well-being are not viable, it's important to understand and think about why they're not viable. What are these different groups going to do to push back against them? There's a big difference between what groups that are kind of working and might not see that might be affected adversely by a climate policy might do to react to it compared to what a large company might do. Workers are going to react differently to a large company. And let's get into why. So there's one example that you read about last week that I think is particularly illustrative and germane and new in a lot of ways, still relatively new. And that's the Yellow Vest protests in France. So what happened in France is Emmanuel Macron implemented or proposed to implement an additional fuel tax that would hit consumers basically at the pump when they went to fill up their cars. And working people who lived largely in the suburbs outside of Paris and commute into the city to work rose up, saying that this would be a bridge too far. It would make it impossible for them to commute in an affordable way to where they needed to go to work, and the cost of living would simply be too high. There were protests, there were strikes, there was massive disruption in France, and this lasted weekend after weekend after weekend for at least a year, and it eventually secured some victories. Macron backed off on this policy. But crucial to understand here is that the type of policy, like that fuel tax, that affects working people's well-being is going to elicit that kind of a response, potentially, the type of response where people protest, where people push back through direct action. By contrast, a policy that might threaten the profits of a private company without directly affecting working people could have a different effect. It could cause instead the companies to push back through electoral politics, funding politicians' campaigns that they think will be supportive of them, by potentially threatening a capital strike to pull their businesses out of the country. But different political strategies are going to be deployed depending on whether the environmental policy targets GDP growth per se, or if it's targeting the well-being, the quality of life, the ability to afford basic services of working people, right? So that's the point that I really want to underscore there. Okay, pivoting again. Naomi Klein, in the chapters that we read, starts out by talking about the inauguration, the election of Barack Obama. A moment when Obama had was quite popular, had a strong mandate to govern, and actually had Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. Now, Obama was a president who was cognizant of climate change. He knew about it. He talked about it during the campaign. He talked about the urgent need to act on climate change. And at a time of economic crisis, the financial crash and recession of 2008 and 2009, the banks were on their back foot and needed a federal bailout. So under these conditions, Naomi Klein asked the question, why didn't Barack Obama enact the so-called Great Green Transformation? Why didn't he attach conditions to banks, forcing them to invest those funds in public infrastructure, in green infrastructure, and in renewable energy? Why didn't he direct the economy towards massive investment in a sustainable future? And there's a lot of different answers to this question, and I'd love to hear what you all think about it, whether or not you agree with Klein's assessment. But in essence, Klein argues the following. Klein argues that there was practical barriers, political barriers that Obama may have confronted, but given that there was broadly favorable political conditions, there was something else going on. And to Klein, what was going on was ideology, that Obama had a program, an idea of how politics worked that he couldn't really get away from. She calls this kind of program neoliberalism. Now, this is a word that you might have heard before. It gets thrown around a lot. It means different things to different people. But what Klein argues is that neoliberalism is a specific political program that came out of a moment starting really in the 1970s. And there was three ingredients that brought neoliberalism into being. First is an ideology that privatization is good, that communism is a foe, that socialism is a foe, that free enterprise and free markets are the best way to maximize the social good. It also required a moment of crisis, and the moment was the crises of the 1970s, the falling profits of American companies, the oil price spikes that hit consumers pretty hard, and overall economic contractions and inflation. And it finally needed a narrative. And in this case, Klein argues, the narrative was about American values, about freedom, about individual liberty. And by combining these things together, they were able to advance a program of privatization, bringing formerly public entities under private control, under private control, of deregulation, of removing environmental and labor regulations that were thought to be barriers to investment, and to cut public services to fund tax cuts primarily for the wealthy. Naomi Klein terms this program, born out of these conditions, neoliberalism. And I personally do find that to be a useful term because it helps us to understand a lot of different policies that have been implemented by governments around the world. Another term for this ideology, this economic program, was trickle-down economics that Ronald Reagan ran on explicitly, along with George H.W. Bush, who was his vice president. So this was kind of the trajectory that Klein talks about. But she also advances a potential alternative for what we might learn from this approach to politics, this kind of framework for thinking about politics in the moment that we're in right now. She doesn't name the system, the alternative to neoliberalism, but she does propose that there might be certain conditions right now that we can take as a starting point for understanding what an alternative could look like. The ideology, the values that she proposes might undergird such a program would be public goods, democratic control, sustainability. The moment paralleling the economic crises of the 1970s are ecological and, yes, economic crises of today. And there's also a narrative that could very much accompany this program. Jobs as a right, rights in general, beautiful cities, green spaces, water, resources, nature, international solidarity, things that people could really come around to liking. Now, she doesn't name this system, but she suggests that the program that would come with it would include democratic control of utilities, local democratic control in particular, pro-public health regulations, and more taxes on the quote-unquote rich and the filthy to fund big public investments in renewable energy, in public transit, in public housing, all of the kinds of things that are commonly talked about with the Green New Deal and are necessary, Klein argues, to transform the economy away from fossil fuels. So who might be part of this kind of Klein coalition? It might include labor, it might include unions, it might include homeowners seeking relief, environmentalists, and just citizens who want transit and infrastructure and a high quality of life. At the same time, There's going to be lots of different actors contesting in the future, regardless of what happens in electoral politics, to determine what mix of solutions, what mix of policies gets included in a future environmental policy strategy for the US or anywhere else. We might even think about this as being a way that the Green New Deal might be contested. Environmentalists, workers in urban places, communities, farming communities, fossil fuel companies, agricultural firms are all likely to have different ideas about what the Green New Deal or what environmental policy ought to be. They're likely to favor different types of solutions, from incentives to public investment to protected areas. So it would behoove us to think about what fossil fuel companies might want. What are homeowners going to want? What might wealthy and middle-class suburbanites want? What might working class and poor urban communities want? At the end of the day, who's going to benefit from which type of a Green New Deal? And I'd really encourage you to constantly be thinking about that question going forward. Even if we're not thinking about policy at the federal level, states are likely to move forward with this stuff in the near future. And also keep in mind the different tactics and strategies that these different groups are likely to use. There's always going to be media and public narratives, but there's also possibilities and openings for other tactics and strategies to be used. And we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but we do know that strikes, protests, electoral politics, money in politics, media, public narratives are all being deployed by different groups with different stakes and different agendas in this. We're seeing already a large movement, a diverse movement of young people, activists, marginalized communities, people of all different backgrounds who want a sustainable world, agitating for radical, transformative action. We don't know exactly the contours of what this future is going to hold, but there is an awful lot to plug into right now. And I would encourage you to think about how you, as a student, as a scholar, as an activist, or even as someone who's just concerned with the future of the world, regardless of what you end up doing with your life, so to speak, might have these different movements, have these different strategies and tactics, and have this political analysis held closely as you look at what's happening in the world. And I'd love to hear about how you feel you might plug into it and how you think some of this way of thinking about the world can help us to act as political actors in our world. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.